They said my front yard was an ugly eyesore that violated the neighborhood's landscaping rules. I told them it was accomplishing something their expensive sprinkler systems never could. It was staying alive through one of the worst droughts our state had ever seen. 3 months later, the same HOA that threatened to tear out my yard was standing in a courtroom, watching a judge use their own rulebook against them. But before we get into that, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button, because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. I bought my home 11 years ago in a peaceful subdivision just outside Denver. It sat on a half-acre lot with healthy soil, quiet streets, and a homeowners association that seemed to stay out of everyone's business. At least, that's what I believed back then. Then, 2 summers ago, our state was hit by an unforgiving drought. Water restrictions were introduced almost overnight. My neighbors watched their once green lawns turn into dry, yellow patches, while their monthly water bills climbed higher and higher. I finally got tired of watching my own grass die every July just to satisfy some outdated idea of what a proper lawn was supposed to look like. So I started researching better alternatives. I removed every bit of my thirsty Kentucky bluegrass and replaced it with native buffalo grass, along with drought-resistant wildflowers, the same kinds of plants that had naturally grown on this land long before a single house had ever been built. The new landscaping used nearly 80% less water. It stayed green through the hottest part of August. Bees returned. Then the birds came back too. To me, I'd solved a problem. To the HOA, I'd started a battle. What happened next would eventually change the landscaping rules for every homeowner in that entire neighborhood. I just didn't know it yet. 3 weeks after finishing the project, I found a letter waiting in my mailbox. It came on official HOA letterhead and was written like a legal demand. According to them, my property violated the community's uniform landscaping standards, which supposedly required traditional turf grass to be maintained at a specific mowing height across every visible section of the lot. I called the HOA office expecting a simple conversation. Instead, I reached the property manager, who spoke to me as if I'd committed some serious crime. "This isn't optional," she told me. "You have 30 days to restore standard sod, or we'll begin enforcement." I asked her one straightforward question. "Can you show me where the HOA's governing documents actually define what qualifies as acceptable landscaping?" She didn't have an answer. She simply repeated the 30-day deadline. That evening, I did something I'd never bothered doing before. I downloaded the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, all 52 pages, and started reading every single line carefully instead of just skimming through them. That's when I found it. Hidden on page 31 was a single sentence, just one clause, a sentence that the board clearly had never taken the time to read themselves. I didn't tell anyone. I simply took a picture of that page and saved it. That one sentence would eventually decide the entire lawsuit. When the 30-day deadline expired, I didn't make any changes, not because I was trying to be difficult. I wanted to find out just how far they were willing to push this. The answer was much farther than I expected. The first week brought a 100-pound fine. The second week, they doubled it. By the third week, another certified letter arrived, threatening to place a lien against my home if I refused to pay, all because of my lawn. Soon, the certified mail and warning notices became impossible for the neighborhood to ignore. Some neighbors quietly stopped by to tell me they supported what I was doing. Their own water bills had exploded during the drought as well. Others weren't nearly as supportive. One person taped an anonymous note to my front door, calling my yard an embarrassment and saying it made the entire street look rundown. Then Gary, the HOA president, decided to make things personal. He had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. At the next community meeting, he brought up my situation without mentioning my name. He didn't need to. Everyone sitting in that room knew exactly whose property he was talking about. He warned everyone that allowing landscaping like mine would create a dangerous precedent, capable of lowering property values throughout the entire community. I stayed in the back of the room without saying a single word. The only thing running through my mind was that one sentence on page 31, because Gary, and every other board member sitting, at that moment, I still didn't completely understand what Priya meant, but I could tell from the expression on her face that the HOA had made a major mistake, one so serious that Gary and the rest of the board had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. The court hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. I spent every single day of those 6 weeks preparing. Now let me show you what that sentence on page 31 actually said. Buried inside a section covering maintenance standards, the CC and RS stated that all landscaping had to be maintained in a manner consistent with reasonable water conservation practices and all applicable state and local laws. Those 4 words, reasonable water conservation practices, were the loophole the HOA board had completely overlooked. 2 years earlier, our state legislature had passed a law specifically protecting homeowners who wanted to install drought-tolerant, native, and water-efficient landscaping. The law clearly prohibited homeowners associations from banning those types of yards. Any HOA rule that conflicted with the new law was automatically considered void. It couldn't be enforced. No exceptions. Ironically, the very document the HOA was suing me over contained language that legally required them to allow exactly what I had already done. Priya built our defense around 3 key arguments. First, the state law that protected water-efficient landscaping. Second, the conservation clause hidden inside the HOA's own CC and Rs. And finally, the point that mattered most. The HOA board had never officially updated or amended its landscaping rules after the new state law took effect, even though they were legally required to do exactly that. In other words, the lawsuit they had filed against me was based on a rule that had effectively been dead for 2 years. They simply hadn't realized it. By then, I wasn't just defending my yard anymore. I was walking into court carrying the one piece of evidence they never expected anyone to find. The courtroom itself was much smaller than I had imagined. Gary sat beside the HOA's attorney at one table. Priya and I sat across from them. Behind us, several of my neighbors who supported my case filled most of the gallery seats. The HOA's attorney began confidently. He read the landscaping rule aloud and argued that I had knowingly ignored repeated notices while continuing to violate the community standards. His presentation was calm, confident, almost routine. Then Priya stood. She opened the CC and RS and slowly read the conservation clause aloud exactly as it was written. After that, she read the wording of the state statute. When she finished, she turned toward the HOA's attorney and asked a single question. Can you show the court where this HOA formally amended its landscaping regulations to comply with state law as legally required? The room went completely silent. Gary shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His attorney began flipping through folders that didn't contain the answer, because there wasn't one. The judge repeated the same question herself. This time she asked it even more directly. Finally, the HOA's attorney admitted on the record that no amendment had ever been approved. That was the moment I watched their entire lawsuit fall apart. Suddenly, the issue wasn't whether I had violated an HOA rule. The real issue was that the HOA appeared to have spent the last 2 years issuing fines and legal threats based on a rule that state law had already made unenforceable. The judge didn't simply deny their request for an injunction. She asked a follow-up question that changed everything. Looking directly at the HOA's attorney, she asked, "How many homeowners in this community have been fined under this same unenforceable rule?" No one representing the HOA had an answer, but I did. During those 6 weeks of preparation, I had quietly spoken with neighbors throughout the subdivision. By the time we reached court, I had already identified at least 4 other families who had received landscaping fines for drought-resistant yards during the previous 2 years. The judge denied the injunction. She dismissed the lawsuit entirely. Then she ordered the HOA to refund every fine collected under that invalid landscaping rule since the state law had taken effect, along with the appropriate interest. She also ordered the association to update its CC and RS within 90 days, so they complied with state law or face additional legal consequences. By the time everything was over, the HOA had spent well over $40,000 on legal fees alone. Once the refunds were added, the board's decision to force me into replacing my drought-resistant yard ended up costing every homeowner in the neighborhood through special assessments used to cover the losses. Gary never ran for re-election that year. As for my yard, it stayed exactly the way I had planted it. Green, healthy, covered with bees and native.